And welcome to a brand new edition of Match Points here on tennismajors.com, where we come to debate and discuss the biggest topics in tennis. As we say hello once again to our esteemed panel. First of all, she, of course, the 2013 Wimbledon singles champion. She is a tennis broadcaster, tennis great, and she could have a baby here in about 3 weeks or so, Marion Bartoli. Also joining us once again, the tennis writer of the New York Times, freelance as well as elsewhere. He's also the host of the wildly popular podcast, No Challenges Remaining, Mr. Ben Rothenberg. And finally, joining us once again, outspoken tennis critic, tennis player, and you know him on Instagram and Twitter as well, from Behind the Racket, Mr. Noah Rubin. We begin on a very serious note, and that's with the disturbing allegations of abuse that have been made against Alexander Zverev by his former girlfriend. Let's begin with you, Ben, on this. Should the ATP investigate, and to what degree should the ATP even be involved? Ben.
I do think the ATP needs to do something. I think that as it stands now, this is unresolved, and I think that's a problem for everybody involved. I do think there needs to be some sort of way to reach a resolution here, and I do think the ATP can follow the lead that a lot of other sports leagues have learned the hard way by having cases that they did not respond to sufficiently. And this was 5-6 years ago, and this was getting a lot of attention in North American sports. Famously, Josh, remember like Ray Rice and incidents like that that were black eyes for the NFL, and baseball has had several of these cases as well. Tennis could have followed their lead and gotten ahead of this issue before it hit close to home for tennis. They did not, so they're kind of playing catch up here. But I do think they need to institute some sort of policy, some sort of code of conduct for players or personal conduct policy that other leagues have. Because right now it's just too vague. And I don't think, especially with an issue like domestic violence, you can have a position where you only do something if and when after there's a legal proceeding, because so often there isn't in these cases. And these accusations are still known. And I don't think it helps the sport. I've heard from a lot of fans who've gotten disenchanted with watching tennis in general, just sort of hanging over it the last couple of weeks of the season. And having this player who's Zverev, who's positioned to be one of the big stars of the future, I don't think it's really good for him either to leave this unresolved. I think he should have a conclusion in some way. So I do think that tennis, which has held quote-unquote investigations for much more minor things, like I remember after Kyrgios had his meltdown in Cincinnati last year, they said they were putting an investigation into the incident, even though it all just happened on one match court, and it was on TV and there was no dispute about the facts. Here, it's a case for an actual investigation. However it turns out, I just think it's worth going through the process and making it clear that you take these things seriously, because I don't think tennis has done a good job of even doing that.
All right, Noah Rubin, how about you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there has to be more of an understanding of how to go about situations like this. I think we're fortunate enough, I guess, to not hear it in tennis as much as other sports, but that doesn't mean that you can't have an understanding of what to do in these situations. And like Ben said, I've spoken to people as well, tennis fans, that say this is not okay. We can't have people just smiling, acting like nothing's happening when something of this severity is taking place in our sport. And whatever actually took place, that's up for us to find out. But it's scary. It's scary to act as if this is the status quo. Let's just move on when people's lives are at stake.
Marion, I know you have very strong feelings on this. By all means, please.
No, I'm completely standing by Ben and Noah. I think it's very disturbing actually that the ATP hasn't been reacted yet. I just feel they're standing by whoever PR is sending a code and just trying to put that under the carpet and see what the reactions are. But I think it's not okay to act like that. And no matter what has been happening, obviously we can't judge that because we just have two different versions of a subject has been going on for, I think if I understood well, over a year. So the investigation has to go through all that period and see what the outcome is, but the ATP has to stand up and just say that we can't leave that subject without having our proper investigation and therefore just, see what the outcome is and then take the proper decision in case that actually something that really happened, and then for Zverev to have some sanction, because if it really happened the way she has been describing it, then some serious action needs to be taken over Sasha Zverev. You just can't leave it like this. It's just impossible.
Yeah, Ben, how would this be different if there were not just criminal charges, but even, say, conviction or admission?
Well, we'll see. Actually, I mean, I guess ironically, there's actually another case going on in tennis right now with Nicholas Basilashvili, who's another player who is going to be in a criminal trial in next month in its home country of Georgia. And that case is different because that case is, I believe that case is somewhat connected to a custody dispute, a divorce settlement. So it's a little bit different sorts of stakes. It was already involved in the courts. But the ATP also did not put out any statement when he got charged and brought in. I think it happened back in May, and he's continued to play on tour. He's been playing really badly, so he hasn't been going deep in tournaments and hasn't gotten attention per se. But it's they haven't reacted to that either, and I do think that's also an issue. And tennis just structurally isn't necessarily maybe their defense. Like tennis, unlike other sports, NBA, NFL, doesn't have the capability of suspending players without pay. Because you get paid only for when you play in tennis and when you win matches in tennis. And so this is John Wertheim of Sports Illustrated in 60 Minutes was saying he talked to a NBA executive of some sort who was saying that if there was a case like the Zverev case in the NBA with that sort of fact pattern, the NBA would suspend him with pay pending investigation and sort of take him off the court for a while, let this settle down, and then bring him back. In tennis, if that had happened after Olya Sharipova came up with her allegations, he would have been off court for the Paris Masters, which he made the final of, and then the London World Tour Finals, which are a very lucrative tournament. So it's tough. Tennis just was not equipped for this, and I think that's tennis's fault for being, again, behind the curve, where a lot of other sports had already had examples of how to address this. Tennis has done a bad job of just responding to real world events and real world problems lately. I think this is another pretty clear example of that.
All right, we'll certainly keep our eye on this as we move on now to our second set. And this is about the ATP and WTA rankings. With the 2019 rankings frozen until next March, despite the actual on-court results of 2020, I ask you, two-part question. A, does this system make sense? And B, what would be a better solution? Let's begin with you, Noah Rubin.
There is no great answer. And then I've gone through the rankings. I've spoken to a lot of ATP player relation and just trying to understand what's really taking place. On the Challenger Tour and Future Tour, you can actually have two of the same tournaments count for your ranking. On the ATP, you take your best result out of those 2 years. It's kind of, it's saving a lot of players just for the time being, but it's saving just the masses. And what that means is, when you're looking at it, players can't really move up the rankings unless doing extremely well during this time. And also, the prize money is cut in a lot of places. So players are working twice as hard for half the amount of money. And in actuality, I think we could have taken the hit earlier on, just actually kept the rankings rolling a little bit. But, the problem is we didn't know how long this was going to take. And I think it's showing a little bit of the antiquated system that we're in tennis is that we're, again, going off the first topic a little bit, we're unequipped for these situations. Tennis in a perfect world doesn't work perfectly. So in a non-perfect world, we're struggling with many ideas that we just never thought were going to come our way. So, right now, tournaments are going to start coming off people's list in March. And by that time, you have players that are number one in the world that can be there basically without playing a match for a while.
All right, Marion, how about you? Does this system make sense? And what's a better solution?
Well, I had mini meetings with the WTA on this, and they feel it was the best solution to sort of save the players who were sort of scared to go back on competition and to, guarantee them a spot to be back on tour next year with the same ranking and therefore get into the main draw straight away without having them dropping the points, etc., etc. So it's just very weird to explain to someone who doesn't follow tennis regularly that, for example, a player could have played not playing at all through coronavirus and still be number one in the world like Ashley Barty. It's very difficult to explain that. But I also stand by the players who is about 45, 50, has a lot of points to defend, doesn't really feel like she can practice the way she wants to practice because she lives in a country with different rules and regulation in terms of coronavirus. And therefore, you don't really want her to drop over 90 or 100 in the world and be in the position not to get into the main draw of the Australian Open, for example, and lose that money. So it's a very difficult position to be in. I just felt they tried to save the lower ranked player from the financial difficulty of not being into the main draw for 2021. And I can understand that. But I think for the top 10 or for the top players, they might have a different solution in order for them to do not have someone not playing at all one match and still be number one in the world. But I think globally, they try to think more about the low-ranked player and try to save them. rather than thinking about the top players, which, they feel like if she stayed number one in the world, that's fine, and we're just not gonna touch that.
Ben, how about you?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think I did like the solution when they came up with it back in the summer. I do think it made sense. I do think that there are a lot of different players who are facing different realities in terms of their travel situations and their travel possibilities, or at least we definitely thought that in the summer. There'd be a lot of uncertainty. Will players from every country be able to enter the US, the EU for these sorts of tournaments? And you didn't want anybody to get punished because of political type situation or immigration situation where they weren't able to travel freely. And that could have had a real impact. And even Barty, Barty is from Australia. They've had a lot of tougher restrictions in Australia than other countries. Kyrgios, also from Australia, hasn't played anything since the resumption. It's a tough situation there. And so I don't think Barty should be punished for not feeling comfortable or able to play during a pandemic. I think that's a reasonable choice, and that's why they made this rule. So players wouldn't feel forced to make a choice to put themselves at risk during this still dangerous time when people are getting COVID and a lot of people having serious consequences for it. I understand that risk for an athlete. I do at the same time think it's sort of muzzled the tour, or just capped it in this way where it's really hard to move up right now. Because players' points aren't falling off and people aren't falling down the rankings. It's incredibly tough to move. Even like you look at I don't know, even like the top examples, like Andrei Rublev won 5 titles this year, by far the most on the ATP Tour. Only was able to get up to number 8. The players above him, even Federer, who also hasn't played since January, has stayed ranked number 5 because he was just frozen in there with last year's points. So, and some of the things like Tsitsipas keeping his points for winning London last year, when he played a full schedule this year and played London again, that he gets to keep the better result. I understand other players' frustrations with that. But I also don't know what a better solution is. I don't think this is perfect, but I understand why they did it and think it's a reasonable enough choice given the extreme circumstances we're in.
All right, Marion, I know you want to challenge. Go ahead.
Not really challenge, but I thought maybe a better solution would have been if a player is able to compete in that same tournament, then you should, withdraw the points from the year before and then count the points of this year. And then if they are not able at all to come and play, then you keep the points from the year before. I think that would have been a sort of fair situation to everyone, because if you can go to a tournament and compete, then you can defend your points. If you can't go because of travel restriction or you feel it's too scary for you to go and play, then you keep your points from the year before. To me, that would have been a better solution, but
Noah, let me ask you on that. First of all, good idea, bad idea, what Marion proposes?
It's good at the first start and then bad when you come think about it. Then players just don't want to play tournaments. Then you're having players not show up at events, and that's, we can't have that. We don't make money if you don't have, the Tsitsipas's of the world. And I really like the idea because it, forces you to pick that tournament, and you can't just have 2 chances at it. But at the same time, if you're looking at the promotion of the sport, then we're having players not choosing to play events because of that reason.
Ben, go ahead.
Well, we did already have some of that. Nadal didn't play the U.S. Open and got to keep his 2,000 points, and then he was totally fine playing the European events afterwards. And Svitolina didn't come to the U.S. Open. She, I think, it's semifinal points. I want to say there was someone else who went deep the year before who also didn't show up and got to keep their points. We did already have some of that players, and Djokovic didn't play Paris-Bercy this year because he had 1,000 points there from winning last year. So why would he bother when he's doesn't need the extra money and can keep 1,000 points? So we already saw some picking and choosing, some gaming the system. I hope that we get the tour back to normal within the next 8 months or so, conservatively. And by then, eventually things will correct themselves. I think there's some awkward situations with the rankings for sure. It's tough for guys who are doing well, at a challenger type level who really aren't moving up and have a tough time moving forward at all. That's the part, Noah, I'm guessing could speak to. It's just you wouldn't feel like you had the opportunity or the reason for hope to improve. And that's tough. I think that's a bigger issue than probably the stuff that's happening around the top 20.
All right, real quick, just a 1-sentence answer from each of you. Who is the biggest beneficiary of this system as it stands? Who's been the biggest beneficiary? 1 sentence, Noah Rubin.
I think the top, 5 players.
Okay, Ben.
Federer. Federer gets to be a top 5 seed at the Australian Open next year, despite not playing since the Australian Open. So he would have been unseeded probably had he had his normal ranking. So instead of getting Federer and Nadal first round, we'll get him to be a top 5 seed.
There you go. Name names. Marion.
Girls between 50 and 100. because you save them from dropping too much and not being able to get into the main draw of the Australian Open.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on to set number 3. Novak Djokovic continues to make headlines yet again, go figure, supporting a proposed change that I know someone on our panel is a big fan of, and that is to play a best of 3 set matches at Grand Slam events. Other players remain opposed or even undecided on this subject. So the question is this: should the change to 3 sets in Grand Slam events officially be made? Noah, you first.
Obviously, Djokovic is confident in his own abilities, but I would say that best of 5 definitely suits him, and especially against the next generation. I would think that he would want that for many, many years to come, because that, kind of solidifies him and Nadal at the top of the game, more often than not. With that being said, I still agree that I think the first week of Grand Slam should be 2 out of 3 sets. You want to go quarter semifinals, 3 out of 5, that's fine. I think the early rounds, 3 out of 5, are just a waste of time. I know there's great matches there. The tennis is not wasted, but I still think for the evolution of the sport, it's not ideal.
Okay, Marion.
Well, I'm a big believer into the tradition of tennis as much as possible, not to keep all of them, obviously, but for me, a Grand Slam stands for being in 5 sets, and that's why it's so difficult to win it for a guy, because you just have to win possibly 7 matches in 5 sets, and that's why it makes it very special. I agree with Noah. I just don't understand why Novak won this, because he just wins so many matches on the physical side of it. And the final in the Australian Open against Dominic Thiem was a perfect example. You can name a lot of them. The final against Roger the years before in Wimbledon, etc., etc. So maybe the evolution is, as Noah said, to go for the first week in the best of 3, because you just can, shorten the timing on the court, get some more matches going on, and then by the end of the tournament, you get back to 5 sets. But I just don't understand why tennis wants to evolve into something that is so special to Grand Slam and make a lot of matches so special to watch as well. I think there's a lot of different stuff in tennis that could be changed towards a much better game and towards a much better environment for people to be in as a tennis player, as a team, or as a viewer. You can even broadcast tennis in a much different way to make the viewer more attractive, to have an entertainment that is better without shortening the time of the matches. So this is my problem I'm having with that code. But, if he feels comfortable with it, well.
Ben, it's always about evolving and growing new fans, as you well know, and been a proponent thereof. And, the majority of the folks watching these are watching on television. So does Novak have a point? Should these Grand Slam events be best of 3 as well?
To what Noah and Marion said, I do think that having actually Djokovic be such a good best of 5 player and still being for a change to best of 3 adds credibility to his argument. It's clearly not just doing it out of self-interest or saying this is what's advantageous for me. I think he really does think that this is holding back the sport. And we were talking about Djokovic's answer, but I was more struck also this past week by something that Andy Murray said. Andy Murray was even more sort of forceful about it, and he's said things about this before as well. But he was saying that now, when he's had time off the sport as a fan, he said he would not sit down and watch a best of 5 match beginning to end. Actually, he said he would never do it again, which is a pretty strong statement from someone as attached to tennis as Andy Murray. To be making that kind of statement. And he's at a point in his life where he has, 3 young children, he has other things going on. But I do think that's the reality of, that tennis needs to be aware of. It's a huge ask to ask people to block off up to, 4 or 5 hours of their day to watch one tennis match. I think that's unrealistic. I think that.
But Marion makes a great point when she says part of this is endurance. Part of winning it, what makes it special is you have to outlast.
So I remember at the 2016 Rio Olympics, I'm looking at the numbers, and the men's singles tennis final, which was only 4 sets between Del Potro and Murray, lasted around 4 hours. And it's one of the longest one of the longest Olympic medal events there was in the entire Olympics across all the sports. Like, it was just like sort of 50-kilometer race walking or whatever that was longer than it, or things in that sort of category. And I don't think tennis is popular because it's an endurance sport. I don't think anybody, when they're like, what do you like about tennis? It's like, oh, well, it takes a really long time. I don't think that's what people, to me, that's never been satisfying about tennis. To me, that's never been what drew me to tennis. I like seeing the craft. I like seeing the creativity. I like seeing the talent and the skill. I don't think emphasizing the endurance side is important to the essence of tennis. I've never felt that way.
Okay, no, I'm going to come back to you then. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have early rounds playing best of 3 and then late going back to 5. If you had to choose one or the other for these Grand Slams, which do you choose?
That's difficult. I actually do agree with Marion, the idea that there are bigger issues at hand. With that being said, I mean, because as we see, tennis struggling, you still see the slams at the top of the sport. I think there's a lot of things we have to tackle before then. I think this is kind of one of those last situations, because how are we supposed to go to the slams and say, hey, you guys aren't doing well? And they're going to come to us and say, we're the only people that are doing something well. Like, you can't come to us. So I think I would say keep the best of 3 and go do something else and worry about something else.
Keep the best of 3?
I'm sorry,
go
best of 5. Sorry, 3 out of 5. Yes.
Okay, all right. Normally I don't listen when you answer, but I'm glad I was that time. Marion, you have to choose. Is it best of 5 in these Grand Slams, or did something change your mind and shorten it up and play best of 3 for the men?
The best of 5, absolutely. And what Noah said is actually really true. I think that the Grand Slams are the only almost tournament who are doing extremely well in terms of fans, when there used to be fans in the stands, of course, and TV coverage and people watching. And other tournaments had a lot of more struggled. And to me, we have to rethink the way tennis is broadcast. Because when you look at other sports, it's a lot more attractive to the fans because you feel the action a lot more. You feel that you're, by LeBron James when he's shooting a shot, or by Lewis Hamilton when he's driving in his car to be a Formula One world champion once again. And you don't really feel like you're on the court with a tennis player playing it and hitting a tennis ball. And I think to me that should be really the main area where the people could sit and say, okay, let's try to figure out a much better way to have the fan engage and therefore feel there with the players on the court and get that going before we think about the Grand Slam, or actually the only part of our sport who is doing really well.
Ben, you want to add something?
Well, I just want to say, I do think, and not this is exactly what Marion said, but I do think this part that like best of 5 is essential to keeping Grand Slams special. I don't buy that, because I've been a big fan of women's tennis for all this time. And I know Marion, when you're on court at a Grand Slam, even in a best of 3 match, even at US Open where there's a third set tiebreak, let's say, it still feels markedly different than the week, 2 weeks before in Cincinnati. Like, I do think the electricity and the occasion of the Grand Slams will survive any format change, especially because we've already seen women's tennis have it be, ask players who've struggled with winning, ask like Caroline Wozniacki, or, who was such a great player, number 1 at tour events for so long, but had a tough time translating that to this, Grand Slams, where all that was really different was just the stakes. I think the stakes are what matters, and that's what Grand Slams have at their essence, much more than the long matches for them.
Yeah, I don't think people are watching the Grand Slam events because they're like, ooh, we might get 5 sets. I think they're watching because they're the Grand Slam events.
Yeah.
Marion, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead, Marion.
That comes back to the point we had, I think, in the previous show. What you're saying is taking away all the amazing matches all of us remembered as tennis fans, or even, being a tennis player and just watching a 5 set, when you have someone being down 2 sets to love, and then all of a sudden they're coming back to 2 sets to all, and that's where all the drama has been created. And, taking even just Medvedev over Rafa's at last year's US Open final. It was down 2 sets to love. The match would have been finished in an hour and a half, and you don't feel like it's really the drama of a Grand Slam final. And then all of a sudden he's able to take the third, to take the fourth, taking to the fifth, and you have everyone in the stadium on their feet. I mean, he was booed the entire 2 weeks up until that final, when he gets those 2 sets back, and then all of a sudden you have the entire stadium completely behind him, pushing him to actually get even more drama and even more action. And I just feel there is so much more to do in tennis, rather than just cutting that extra bit that, yes, you might not have in every single match of a Grand Slam. Of course, I give you that. But every time it's happening, is actually something that is so special that you can't create that in a 3 sets match. You just can't, especially on the men's side. The women's, it's different, of course, because there is just so much happening already in one match with all the breaks, and then I'm breaking you, and then you bring me back, and whatever. In a men's match, you need to have that extra adrenaline, especially for the crowd to really get involved, and then just say, I really want to get my tickets for the next year US Open final, because I want to lead that moment once again in the crowd. If you want to take that down the line 50 years time from now, because players can't do it anymore physically, fine, but just don't do it now. I mean, physically the players can still do it. In one century you might change it, but just don't now. There's so much more to do.
Okay, got it. Noah, you wanted to add something real quick? Go ahead, real quick.
Yeah, I think she took it a little too far. I think, percentage-wise, out of all the 3 out of 5 sets, we lose a quality of tennis. I think we actually do. I mean, you watch it from first rounds on, and I don't think we're getting enough out of the best matches for all the matches that are just going like a typical 4-set that's just kind of wasting time, I would like to say. I think there's going to be a higher quality of tennis in best of 3, without a doubt.
Marion, go right back.
I just want to give you 2 stats. In this year Roland Garros, the 2 most viewed matches was one from Mute against another guy that finished, I think, at 17-15 in the fifth. And the other one, no, it's true. And the other one was Dominic Thiem over the other French guy, Hugo Gaston, who also went 5 sets. That was the 2 most viewed match, and people were just sticking to. I think they get 5 or 6 million of people watching in France, which is enormous with our population. Just because not only was a French player, but just the adrenaline and the drama, they kept on going back to that match. It was a very small court. The Mute's match was, I think, on court 12 or something. It was a very small court in Paris on a very rainy and cold day. And people was glued to their TV watching it. And I just feel if you take that away, then, there is so much more to take away before that.
All right, Ben, you want to challenge? Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think mentioning that Mute match, I remember that match well. And yeah, the final set was like 18-16, something like that. It was thrilling. Everyone watched the end, but the end was the good part. What you don't need is the 2.5 sets, hours at the beginning in the first like 3 sets of that match when people are just getting started. I mean, the first and sometimes second sets, or maybe the end of the second set is where a best of 5 set match gets kind of interesting when you start seeing maybe there's real stakes. But the first while can just be completely inessential. And we've seen long marathon women's matches too, like Marion, during your career, there was like a great match in Australia between Schiavone and Kuznetsova that went like 16-14 in the third. And that was already plenty of drama. That no one felt shortchanged by that. So I actually do like long final sets. I think keeping the thrilling endings intact is good. Like NHL hockey. I know Noah was watching the Islanders. Like NHL overtime is great, and you don't need the epicness comes at the end when both people were within a shot of winning it, not taking a very long time to set up the high stakes. So I think when you think about going to best of 3, don't think about trimming off 4th and 5th sets. Think about trimming off the first and second sets of a best of 5 match. And that's, I think, a more accurate way to look at editing it.
That'll wrap it up for this episode and for, I guess, this season. Everyone, thanks for watching and being with us this season. We hope to return again next season. Who knows? On behalf of our panel, thanks again. Make sure you follow on all social media and, of course, pay attention to everything happening at tennismajors.com. Happy holidays, everyone.